According to Jacob Buck Lowe, what happened behind the cameras was never meant to be part of a TV show. Footage disappeared, investigations were quietly shut down, and certain locations were never spoken about again. Buck was known as the fearless rookie, the one willing to push forward when others hesitated. But as the seasons went on, viewers noticed something change. The jokes faded, the fear stopped looking playful, and the show itself began to feel heavier. Now, Buck has finally hinted at why. This isn't about monsters or myths, it's about patterns, erased evidence, and warnings that came from places no one expected. What he claims forces a disturbing question. Was Mountain Monsters documenting folklore or stumbling into something real that couldn't be controlled? Before we go any further, subscribe, because once you hear what Buck says really happened, you'll understand why some stories never get a proper ending. Before audiences ever knew him as the wide-eyed rookie willing to charge into the woods, Jacob Buck Lowe was something very different off camera. He wasn't raised on campfire stories meant to scare tourists. He grew up inside the Appalachian foothills where folklore wasn't entertainment, it was local memory. These were stories passed quietly, often with warnings attached. Places you didn't linger, ridges you didn't cross after dark, hollers where search parties went in and never found what they were looking for. Buck absorbed those stories early, but what separated him from others wasn't fear, it was curiosity. He didn't obsess over creatures. He obsessed over why the same locations kept producing the same kinds of stories across decades. As a teenager, he spent hours digging through county records, old newspapers, and handwritten church logs, looking for disappearances and accidents that never quite lined up with official explanations. Long before television, he was already mapping patterns. When Mountain Monsters began filming, Buck joined the team as the youngest and least experienced member. On screen, he was framed as comic relief, eager, fearless, sometimes reckless. It worked. Audiences loved him, but behind the scenes, Buck was doing something very different. While others focused on traps and theories, he started quietly cross-referencing filming locations with historical incidents, missing persons, mine collapses, restricted land purchases that didn't make sense for rural Appalachia. Producers initially dismissed it as overthinking. After all, the show wasn't meant to be an investigation, it was entertainment. But Buck didn't see it that way. To him, the cameras were just tools. The real question was why certain areas reacted the same way every time the team showed up. Equipment failures, sudden silence in the woods, locals refusing to speak once specific ridgelines were mentioned. By the second season, Buck had started keeping a private notebook. Not episode notes, not creature sketches, coordinates, dates, weather shifts, audio anomalies. He never talked about it on camera. When asked, he'd shrug it off with a joke. But crew members later admitted Buck was often the first to go quiet when something felt off, and the last to leave a location once filming stopped. What viewers didn't realize was that Buck wasn't trying to prove monsters were real. He was trying to understand why some places didn't behave like the rest of the world, and that mindset would eventually put him on a collision course with something far bigger than a television show. As Mountain Monsters gained popularity, the structure of the show stayed the same, but the atmosphere didn't. By the third and fourth seasons, something subtle had shifted, and Jacob Buck Lowe was one of the first to feel it. What once felt like stage tension began turning into genuine unease. The woods no longer reacted like a backdrop. They felt alert, as if the environment itself was aware of the crew's presence. On camera, the jokes still landed. The shouting, the running, the exaggerated reactions were all there. But between takes, Buck noticed patterns that couldn't be edited away. Equipment failures weren't random anymore. Cameras would shut down only in certain zones. Batteries drained within minutes in areas locals had warned them not to enter. Audio interference spiked at the same elevations, no matter which county they filmed in. To Buck, that consistency mattered. While the rest of the team focused on the hunt narrative, Buck started quietly comparing locations. He realized many of the most active sites shared strange similarities. Old mining corridors, abandoned rail lines, unexplained land acquisitions, and stretches of forest that appeared on maps but were rarely maintained. In some cases, official property records were incomplete or oddly redacted. That didn't happen by accident. Locals began acting differently too. Early seasons featured people eager to talk. Later shoots were met with silence. Doors closed. Conversations stopped the moment cameras appeared. In one instance, a landowner agreed to be interviewed, then backed out after a brief phone call Buck overheard him take. When asked why, the man simply said, "Y'all don't need to be here," and walked away. Buck started sleeping less. Crew members noticed him pacing at night, listening instead of talking. During one hunt, he refused to step into a clearing despite cameras rolling, quietly telling the others, "This isn't where we're supposed to be standing." That moment never aired. Producers said it slowed the episode. What disturbed Buck most was how often the fear felt anticipatory, not reactive. Sounds happened before movement. Silence fell before activity. It felt less like they were chasing something and more like something was deciding whether to engage. When Buck raised these concerns privately, he was told not to overthink it. The show had a tone to maintain, but by then, Buck understood something critical. If this were just folklore, randomness would rule. Instead, the patterns were tightening, and when patterns tighten, it usually means something is being controlled. That realization marked the moment Buck stopped seeing mountain monsters as a show and started seeing it as a record of places people weren't meant to document. The breaking point came during an investigation that never made it to television. Internally, it was treated like any other case, a new location, local reports, and a build-up toward a nighttime hunt. But from the moment the crew arrived, Jacob Buck Lowe knew this one was different. The area felt restricted in a way that had nothing to do with posted signs or property lines. There were no warnings, yet everything about the place suggested they weren't supposed to be there. The first red flag was the absence of locals. In past investigations, someone always lingered nearby, curious onlookers, landowners, or neighbors watching from a distance. This time, the surrounding area was empty. No houses with lights on, no distant vehicles, just silence that felt deliberate. Buck later said it reminded him of land that had been quietly cleared, not abandoned. During setup, equipment issues began immediately. Thermal cameras showed movement with no heat source attached. Motion sensors triggered without recording anything. Audio picked up low-frequency interference that engineers couldn't trace. These weren't failures, the devices were functioning, just not in ways that made sense. Buck started documenting everything in a personal notebook, noting timestamps and locations the production logs ignored. The moment that changed everything happened after midnight. While reviewing live feeds, Buck noticed a humanoid shape on thermal, upright, still, and facing the crew. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't flee. It simply stood there, as if waiting. When Buck called it out, multiple cameras cut at once. The feeds went dark for nearly 2 minutes. When systems rebooted, the footage was gone. Producers initially blamed corruption, but Buck overheard an editor later say something that didn't sit right. There was a second copy. That copy, Buck was told, had been flagged and removed before the team even returned home. No explanation followed. The episode outline was rewritten within days. What should have been the central encounter was replaced with vague sounds, jump cuts, and a false alarm conclusion. Buck knew editing tricks. He could spot continuity errors instantly. Weather didn't match. Dialogue was missing. Reaction shots were reused out of sequence. The story had been altered to erase something specific. When Buck pushed back, he was told the same thing repeatedly. It doesn't fit the tone. But tone wasn't the issue. Control was. That unaired investigation marked the first time Buck realized decisions were being made above the production level. Someone outside the show had weighed in, and whatever they saw in that footage, they didn't want it explained or remembered. After the unaired investigation, things didn't return to normal. They tightened. Schedules became vague. Locations were changed without explanation. Certain areas Buck had flagged for follow-up were quietly removed from future plans. And then came the warning. It happened days before the next scheduled shoot. Jacob Buck Lowe received a call from an unlisted number. No caller ID, no voicemail afterward. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, and unnervingly specific. The man addressed Buck by full name and referenced a location the crew hadn't announced publicly yet. Then he said something Buck would never forget. "You've already documented what you weren't supposed to. Don't push it further." The call ended without a threat, without emotion. That's what disturbed Buck the most. It wasn't intimidation, it was instruction. Buck tried to brush it off as a prank until he checked his phone records. The call didn't exist. No entry, no routing data. When he contacted his carrier, they claimed a temporary system error had occurred. The next day, even that explanation disappeared. The record was gone. He told a producer who dismissed it as coincidence. He told another crew member who joked about fans going too far. But when Buck finally told Trapper, the reaction was different. Trapper didn't laugh. He didn't question it. He simply went quiet before saying, "That means you're getting close." From that point on, Buck became hyper-aware of small details. Vehicles parked too long near their base camp. Drones that appeared briefly overhead before vanishing. Sudden radio interference whenever certain topics came up on set. None of it was dramatic enough to prove, but together it formed a pattern. During one filmed hunt, Buck broke character and spoke directly into the camera, saying, "If someone's watching this, maybe you should tell us why." That line never aired. Editors later claimed it disrupted the pacing. Buck knew better. It disrupted something else. Soon after, new non-disclosure agreements were issued. They were longer, stricter, and unusually broad. Language about unaired material, field anomalies, and external review appeared where it never had before. Buck realized the show wasn't just being produced anymore. It was being monitored, and whatever had been captured during that lost investigation hadn't scared the network. It had alerted someone else entirely. By the time Jacob Buck Lowe realized something was seriously wrong, it was already too late to stop it. The footage from the unaired investigation, the night everything shifted, had entered a phase Buck would later describe as disappearing while we were still standing there. In post-production, Buck requested to review the raw files himself. This wasn't unusual. Cast members had always been allowed to sit in on early cuts, especially when something significant happened in the field. But this time, the response was different. He was told the files were being stabilized. Then he was told they were temporarily locked for review. Then, finally, he was told something that made his stomach drop. The files were no longer accessible to the editing team at all. A longtime editor pulled Buck aside off the record and told him the truth in a whisper. A duplicate of the raw footage had been pulled directly from the server and encrypted, not by the network's usual post-production staff, but by an external party that logged in remotely. The file tag wasn't labeled by episode or date. It was marked restricted material. Within days, the episode outline was rewritten. Scenes were reordered. Dialogue no longer matched the environment. Night shots suddenly cut to daytime audio. What had been a central encounter was replaced with a vague false alarm narrative. Viewers later noticed it immediately. The episode felt wrong, incomplete, like it had been hollowed out. Buck confronted production about it. He wasn't angry yet, just confused. He asked a simple question. Why are we pretending nothing happened? The response wasn't an answer. It was a warning. He was told continuing to push could jeopardize the show's future and his role in it. That was when Buck understood the stakes. This wasn't about entertainment quality or continuity errors. This was about removal, not editing, erasing. Soon after, a second editor quit abruptly. No explanation. His name vanished from the credits on the following episodes. Another staffer told Buck she'd been instructed never to discuss that investigation again, even internally. The phrase used was chillingly specific. It's not part of the record. Then came the final confirmation. Buck attempted to access his own personal backup drive, footage he'd copied in the field as a precaution. The drive powered on, spun, and then failed completely. A data specialist later told him the corruption pattern was unusual, resembling a targeted overwrite rather than random damage. By the end of that month, the footage was gone, not lost, not misplaced, removed. And the most disturbing part wasn't that the network allowed it to happen. It was that they seemed relieved when it was finally gone. After the footage vanished, Jacob Buck Lowe noticed something that unsettled him more than the lost files ever could. The energy on set changed, not dramatically, quietly, like a room where a conversation stops the moment someone walks in. Production meetings became closed door. Decisions that used to involve the whole Ames team were suddenly handled by people Buck didn't recognize. New faces appeared with vague titles: compliance, review, liaison. They didn't joke. They didn't watch monitors for entertainment. They watched people. Buck started feeling like the hunts were no longer being designed for discovery, but for control. Locations were restricted. Certain topics were discouraged before filming even began. When Buck asked why a promising site had been pulled from the schedule, he was told only that it raised concerns. Concerns for who? No one would say. The clearest sign came during a shoot, when Buck requested a copy of raw thermal drone footage. He'd seen something move through the tree line that didn't behave like any animal he knew. Tall, upright, too fast. The drone operator told him the feed had glitched. When Buck asked for the backup, he was informed it had already been reformatted. That had never happened before. Soon after, the team received updated filming guidelines. Buried deep in the language was a new restriction. Content involving non-verifiable biological entities was no longer approved for broadcast. The phrasing wasn't scientific. It wasn't legal. It felt governmental. Buck realized then that Mountain Monsters wasn't just being edited, it was being filtered. Even on camera, things felt different. Conversations were cut mid-thought. Equipment malfunctions Buck knew weren't natural were reframed as jokes. Moments of genuine fear were smoothed over in post-production. The show still looked the same to viewers, but to Buck, it felt staged in reverse. Reality being bent to fit a safer narrative. Behind the scenes, paranoia crept in. Buck noticed his phone behaving strangely, contacts disappearing, battery draining without explanation. Once he found his email inbox wiped clean of months of correspondence related to production. The network blamed a sync error. Buck didn't. He began writing everything down. Dates, names, incidents. He stopped trusting digital storage. If something happened, he wanted a record that couldn't be remotely altered. He also stopped talking freely on set, not because he was scared of the monsters, but because he no longer knew who might be listening. The final straw came when a producer told him, almost kindly, "You need to decide whether you want to keep making television or keep asking questions." That's when Buck understood the truth. Mountain Monsters hadn't uncovered something dangerous in the woods. It had crossed a line where someone else decided the story needed to stop being told. By By the time the pressure peaked, Jacob Buck Lowe knew he was alone in his concern. Not because the others didn't sense something was wrong, but because they were choosing silence. New NDAs made speaking risky. Careers were on the line. Families were mentioned in meetings more than locations. Buck didn't blame them, but he couldn't do the same. He began asking questions anyway, quiet ones, off camera. He reached out to a former production assistant who admitted an outside group had accessed the show's servers. Not network, not legal, federal. The word wasn't explained. It didn't need to be. Another contact showed Buck a fragment of a server log listing mountain monsters alongside other media suppression cases. The label didn't reference folklore or entertainment. It referenced containment. That was the moment Buck stopped believing this was about ratings, liability, or image. It was about control. Soon after, he was warned again, this time indirectly. A producer told him certain conversations were being flagged. Another suggested he take time off. Buck refused. He'd come to a conclusion he couldn't walk back from. If the show stayed quiet, the truth disappeared. And Buck wasn't willing to let that happen, no matter what it cost him. After Buck refused to back down, the consequences came quietly. His screen time shrank. Meetings happened without him. Archived footage he requested was suddenly unavailable, then outright denied. When he hinted online that material had been removed, the posts vanished within hours, and his account was briefly locked for abnormal activity. No explanation followed. Soon after, Buck stepped away. Officially, it was personal time. In reality, the door had closed. Years later, Buck rarely speaks about mountain monsters. When he does, he avoids details. No creatures, no locations. He talks about patterns, about how fast truth disappears when it makes the wrong people uncomfortable. Fragments still surface now and then. A clipped frame, a mismatched line, a screenshot, only to be erased just as quickly, but the memory lingers. Buck once said, "The scariest thing we found wasn't in the woods. It was how easily everyone agreed to pretend it wasn't real." The show didn't end with a finale. It ended with silence. And somewhere between the missing footage and the edits that followed, Buck learned the truth. Some monsters don't chase you. They erase you. According to Jacob Buck Lowe, what happened behind the cameras was never meant to be part of a TV show. Footage disappeared. Investigations were quietly shut down, and certain locations were never spoken about again. Buck was known as the fearless rookie, the one willing to push forward when others hesitated. But as the seasons went on, viewers noticed something change. The jokes faded, the fear stopped looking playful, and the show itself began to feel heavier. Now, Buck has finally hinted at why. This isn't about monsters or myths. It's about patterns, erased evidence, and warnings that came from places no one expected. What he claims forces a disturbing question. Was Mountain Monsters documenting folklore, or stumbling into something real that couldn't be controlled? Before we go any further, subscribe, because once you hear what Buck says really happened, you'll understand why some stories never get a proper ending.